But no, yeah, it's...
So the Consumer Reports thing wasn't done in a low signal area. It was done in a signal empty room with a signal creating device right next to the iPhone.
Well, yeah, well, and you know what's so funny about that is Consumer Reports is being bashed by all the Apple fanboys and to a point by Apple for being honest. You know, not falling in love with Apple, just going, we love the device, we like it, but there's a prerequisite to a phone in that it should function as a phone. We're sorry, no matter how much we love it, if it doesn't function as it's supposed to, we can't, in good ethics, recommend it. And that was basically what they said, we love this thing, but as long as this issue exists, we can't recommend it. And so Steve Jobs' interpretation of that was, Consumer Reports says the iPhone's number one. I found that to be a really interesting interpretation of that particular report. And he went on at one point in his hour-long, 15-minute slideshow explaining why it isn't Apple's fault. It's okay, it's closer to 30 minutes, but yeah. Saying you have to be in these signal void rooms, and that's the only way to do a proper test. Now, granted, he was talking about the multi-million-dollar ones that Apple uses, but for the purpose of the test Consumer Electronics said, like you said, a poor man's version of that to isolate and do a true test. So it's not, okay, is it weak here, is it sun, is it here, is it sun? Take all those variables out and just test signal versus device, which is exactly what Consumer Electronics did. And that's exactly what Steve Jobs is saying you have to do, yet he doesn't like their test, is the one thing I couldn't quite figure out there. It's like the thing what was it?
Consumer Reports did say that other phones don't suffer from the same problem.
Well, it's like we've talked about this, we've done it, it's like the third week we're going on this because it's been brought up, but it's like Rim said, like everyone else said, it's all devices get resistance when you test them, but they don't fall off into oblivion, and that's what Consumer was saying and everything else. It's what I found interesting was the quote while we're on the signal thing, where they were saying, we knew you could see bars drop on a phone when you hold it a certain way. It's a fact. Phones aren't perfect, but people are reporting better reception with antenna than they've ever had before. I want to know who these people are, because Apple bombarded us with statistics here. They said, what was it, 0.5%, 0.55% of all iPhone 4 people actually called in and complained about this. So apparently, according to Apple statistics, nobody's calling Apple. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that isn't true, because I don't think they'd get up and just write out lie. But do you think nobody called Apple because they weren't having this problem, or because they knew what the problem was and they knew there was no point in calling Apple, especially with things circling around the internet which basically said, if you call Apple, they will tell you it's not a problem and direct you around in circles? It's like, would you call Apple Care if that's what's going around the internet and everything else, and you have everyone on the internet going, this is a design flaw with the phone? Would you call them to bitch at it, or would you just go...
I think I'd just jump into the class action lawsuit.
Yeah, it's like they're saying it's not an issue because most people didn't call us.
Isn't that lawsuit still going to go out now that the bumpers are being given out?
I don't know if it has any legs. Apple really can't be held at fault in that suit now. Now that they've given the bumpers, now that they've addressed that at their cost, and they're reimbursing anyone who suffered damages. Well, okay, the people who possibly have legs in that suit are people who bought a non-Apple case, because those are not covered. Or, it's like, and I kind of feel sorry for those people, or people who've had to pay restock fees and haven't been refunded, or things like that. Most of the legs of the suit at this point are against that would have any ground to run on would be against AT&T. Like not letting people out of contracts, not refunding activation fees, not things like that. It's for the most part Apple's taking care of their financial responsibility. They've done their job for their shareholders, which is I think what this was all about. It's the one thing that didn't actually get talked about here, and it was really funny to watch what Apple's stock did right after this conference. It just started to go back up. It's like, but it had been going down. Apple's stock had been adversely affected by this whole little thing. Not a lot, but enough that Apple needed to do something like this, if only to honor their responsibility to their shareholders. It's like, again, they bombarded us with statistics for 20 minutes. They said 0.5% of all iPhone people who called in. 6% of 3GSs were returned. 1.7% of iPhone 4s have been returned. So saying less people returned them. So therefore it was not a problem, because people aren't returning the phone. I'd be willing to bet most people are going and buying a $30 bumper. Or some other case. So
it would be interesting to see how well case sales were compared to the two.
Well, no, and what was really interesting here was they gave us all these statistics, and they preached about how it's not their fault and how it's a non-issue, and clearly less than 1% of all iPhone 4 people are suffering this. I want to ask Mr. Bitt on Thursday what he thinks of that, because one of the things he said last Thursday was all 7 of his friends who have an iPhone 4 have this problem. So what, is he just really unlucky and all 7 of his friends are in the 1%?
There's chances of that.
Let's do the chances of that. Let's do the math here. Let's see.
What is that? Is that like...
100% of the people he knows are in 1% of the iPhone demographic. What are the odds?
7 people, huh?
Anyways, it's one of those things. And then, after giving us all these numbers to show why it isn't their fault, they kind of admitted it was a problem without actually admitting it. You've watched it, James, you haven't. So it's like, but what he did was he said, well, we can't tell you the actual number of dropped calls because AT&T doesn't want us to. I wonder why. But we can tell you the delta. And I think they looked at this like, how can we make this look as small as possible? What they said was it's less than 1 extra dropped call per 100 calls. Okay? Over millions of phones and millions of calls, that's a lot of fucking calls. And it's bigger, which goes directly in the contrary of everything else they're saying. They spent 20 minutes saying it's a non-issue, it doesn't exist, none of our users are suffering from this, it's just a lot of loud minority. The antenna is the best one we've ever had. It's a perfect design. It's better. All phones do this. And then they just kind of shuttled under the rug this statistic that, by the way, it drops more calls than the previous version. But we're not going to tell you how many. And it's not our fault. And it's a better phone. Am I the only one whose head that made hurt?
Well, I know that I would be upset if my phone
all 7 of his friends.
calls. So.
No, good. Is Leo say that again?
I said that I would be upset if my phone dropped 1 out of every 100 calls.
No, it's less than 1 more. We don't know how many out of 100 get dropped on the iPhone. They wouldn't say that number. They just said the iPhone 4 dropped slightly less than 1 more than the 3G did.
Well, even so, I would say just for the sake of argument, even if it was just dropping 1 out of every 100 calls, then that I would still find that unacceptable because my current phone does not do that.
Yeah, well, no, when Apple said it's unacceptable too. Anyway.